we heard a lot about clinical trials, and we also discussed that many of you either have not enrolled in a clinical trial, aren't really clear what a clinical trial is. So I'm here to give you a quick rundown on what they are and why they're important. So what are clinical trials? These are research studies, just like studies you might find in a laboratory, except these are studies that involve people. They're designed to answer specific questions. They're about new and existing treatments. And their goal is to improve the overall quality of life or the benefit that treatments bring to people with various diseases. So there we heard about phase 1, 2, 3, and then beyond. We're just going to focus on today on those first 3 phases, 1, 2, and 3. But this slide here just gives you an idea. If you imagine one drug, one treatment that you receive in the hospital, before it ever got to that stage, it had to undergo many phases of scientific investigation, starting with very early concepts and then moving through these preclinical and then clinical studies involving larger and larger groups of people before it then ultimately goes on to receive approval. But this process can take 15 years, 10 to 15 years, and you might start with 5,000 to 10,000 different compounds or drugs in the very beginning stages, but only wind up with one that ultimately makes it to approval. So it's very hard to improve, and it does involve a lot of work. But that middle section there, clinical trials, cannot happen without the participation of patients. So what are the different phases? In phase 1 trials, again, these are small trials, they say, they ask, is this treatment safe? It's often the very first time the drugs are given to humans, and so the impact they may have, whether good or bad, is not known. And so they will usually start with very small doses of these drugs, usually given one at a time, and then slowly increase that dose until they find what's called a toxicity. At what point do we realize that the harm is greater than the potential benefit? And this is how they come up with what sort of dosage they might try to move into future trials. And then, of course, they're looking at safety. We want to make sure that they're not causing harm. When something then gives some initial signals that it looks promising, they'll take it to a phase 2 study, which then asks, does it work? Does it do what we think it's supposed to do? So they'll look for very specific effects in the patients, continuing to monitor for any of those side effects so that they can develop a very clear understanding of who tends to respond to these types of treatments versus who doesn't. How can they better refine? What sort of knowledge can they gain from these studies to improve them so that they can ultimately benefit more patients? And these phase 2s are larger. They can go up to 500 patients. Now, these first 2 studies are typically found, phases are typically found in your very large or cutting-edge academic clinical research centers. For many years, it was very rare to find a phase 1 study, a highly experimental study, at a community oncologist location. However, now this is changing, certainly in the field of immunotherapy, as these treatments become better understood by general oncologists, and as more of these treatments become FDA approved and available for those oncologists to prescribe to their patients, we might see more of these studies happening earlier. Also, unique, I think, to immunotherapy, at least in recent years, we've had FDA approvals based just on these 2 phases alone. If even, there might be a phase 1/2 study, the benefit is so clear so quickly that it receives a fast track approval. And that, of course, is great for patients, because the sooner you can get these out to the broader oncology community, the better. But traditionally, and sometimes this still happens in phase 3 studies, especially where there are current standards of care that are known to have some benefit, but we think this drug or this drug combination is going to be better. So that's what these phases ask. And so this will be a comparison, direct comparisons. It can be a comparison of one drug to another drug, combination to another combination or series of drugs. There's a multitude of ways to design these studies, and all of them are grounded in key scientific questions and designed to answer those questions. But ultimately, you hope by the time you get to a phase 3 study, there is a clear signal. The government regulators who control what drugs get approved can say, okay, we know this is going to work, the data is good, and let's approve this. So these studies can involve thousands and thousands of patients. And because so many patients are required, you'll often see these happening at multiple treatment centers around the country and in other countries. All of that data gets collected and centralized and analyzed together. So there are pros and cons to entering clinical trials. And before I get into this, I just want to again reiterate that clinical trials are what are needed to make drugs reach FDA approval. And again, patient participation is so important. You, if you are considering an immunotherapy, may have the option, since many have been approved already as standard treatments, of receiving that in the course of your regular care. For instance, with lung cancer, it's now, or certain types of lung cancer, it's now the frontline treatment. Those patients in stage 4 advanced lung cancer don't get the chemotherapy as a first line. So that's really wonderful, but we can't know that without your participation. But again, pros and cons. Pros are, this is one of the ways that you can get access to cutting-edge treatments before they're available to anybody else, and you're also getting the best possible care. We heard Dr. Friedman say earlier that, for instance, with the question on side effects, that these clinicians and the nurses and everyone involved in this trial is extremely vested in how you are doing, how you're responding, in addition to getting that high-quality scientific data they need. But really, their first priority is your health. Yes, and then you also get to play a chance. This is, we all know that your first thought as a patient is not, oh, I want to help other patients. You're there to get treated and cured yourself, potentially. But as you consider a clinical trial, one of the things you may find appealing is knowing that whether or not it ultimately benefits you, because it's part of a larger study, it will ultimately benefit other cancer patients down the road. Some disadvantages are, these are the first time, as I said, sometimes these drugs are being tested in patients and we don't know what the side effects or risks can be. As you enter these trials, any sort of information that the doctors have based on preclinical studies, or if you're in a later phase study, those earlier clinical trials, that information that can indicate, what the potential risks are, you will be informed of that, and that's part of that big long document that Mary Elizabeth Williams said that she received when she entered a clinical trial. Also, we don't know, all patients may not benefit, of course, but that's the case with any treatment you get, so that's not surprising. You may be required to make frequent clinical visits to get scans and blood tests and biopsies. All of this is explained to you up front, and as Mary Elizabeth said, if you're not fully 100%, if you don't understand completely what's going to be involved, just ask and ask and ask until you get that information. And then you may need to travel to trial sites. For some patients, that's easier than for others. There are services and organizations out there that do help with transportation. But as I said, as these immunotherapies become more and more part of the standard of care, patients are having to travel not as far because they're now available in their communities. This is a list of things that you'll want to consider asking before you opt in to volunteer for this trial. I won't go through them all, but you'll want to know things like, why do you think this is going to work for me? What sort of benefit did we see? How did other patients who have received this fare? How will I know if this is working? That's a question we got earlier. How long will this trial last? Why are you doing this trial? Why do you think this drug is going to be better than what I would get from, my regular oncologist? Some trials can last for many, many years. Others have a finite period of time. And so a question is, okay, so I'm on this trial and it seems to be working. Am I going to continue to receive this drug after the trial closes? You'll want to know that. What will be the impact on your daily life? Will you have to be hospitalized, or is this just you go into the clinic and you come out? In fact, most immunotherapies have relatively low side effects, certainly not the sort that really debilitate you that we might see with chemotherapy or radiation therapy. So many immunotherapy, that's not to say it doesn't happen, but most patients can have these kind of outpatient experiences. They go and they get a quick infusion and they go on with their day. And then, of course, you'll want to know what other costs are associated with your participation in this trial. Most of the trial costs, anything directly associated with the trial itself, the drug, the healthcare team, all that's covered by the trial sponsor. But there may be periphery charges just associated with your general hospital visit or other scans that may be required as part of your regular care. We heard that getting into a clinical trial isn't always a given. There are many eligibility requirements that are put in place, and this is intended for your safety. They're designed to make sure that, first, that these trials are designed to answer these scientific questions, and so they've got to be, they are studies, they have to be carefully designed, there have to be controls and things in place, and so that means not all patients are going to be eligible, so make sure you ask. You might be made worse, for instance, by receiving a drug that we know if you have this marker or this biomarker, we think you might have a bad reaction, or you're not likely to respond because you lack that biomarker, those sorts of things. Again, things you'll want to ask your doctor. Other criteria include your general state of overall health, stage and type of your cancer, any other genetic factors, your age, medical history, etc. Remember, this is a dialogue you have to have. Many of you, you're going to have all these questions, and just ask them. Take your time. Now, there's some myths associated with clinical trials. One of the most common I hear is that I'm going to get a placebo. I'm not actually going to get a treatment, when in fact, while this does happen in very, very rare cases, and in those cases, and there's a scientific reason why, in those cases, you're made known of all the chances, what's your chances at 50-50 of getting drug or treatment, et cetera. But they're rarely, rarely used. And if there is some form of treatment that we know may potentially benefit you, you almost certainly will receive that and not a placebo. But again, ask your oncology team. Another myth is that trials are only for people that have run out of treatment options, that this is a last resort, an act of desperation, and this is not true. Many trials in the beginning, certainly in immunotherapy, could only enroll patients who already were at advanced stages of disease and who had failed prior lines of therapy. But now, as immunotherapies have become approved as frontline, we're learning more and more about how these work. We're seeing patients enroll at earlier and earlier stages of their cancer journey, and that's a good thing, because think about it. Don't you think your immune system is more likely to work if it's not been completely destroyed by chemotherapy, for instance? So if that is an option to you, that's something you'll want to discuss. And just a note about chemotherapy, because I know it gets a bad rap in our circles, but actually chemotherapy has been shown to be a helpful component of overall therapy when you're combining it with immunotherapy and radiation therapy. So don't write it off completely. If you go into an immunotherapy trial and you see that there's a chemotherapy or a radiation therapy involved, don't dismiss it flat out. There's probably a good reason for why the study's been designed that way, and you'll want to learn about it. That you'll have to travel to a large hospital, and as I mentioned before, these are found more and more at the community oncology level in both urban and suburban environments. So you can take a look around. And also, with our clinical trial finder service and the navigators that we have here, one of the things you can tell them is how far you're willing to travel, and they can set that as a search parameter and say, okay, let's look within 30 miles of where you live. And then you can expand out from there, depending on your comfort level. A myth is that your health insurance won't cover the cost of care in a clinical trial. And this was something new that I learned actually at one of our immunotherapy summits when one of our patients gave her testimonial about this. And she said that she was able to work with her health insurance provider to get many and surprising number of different costs covered. So if you have healthcare insurance, be sure to also speak with your insurance provider as well as the hospital about ways that insurance can help cover these other costs, these incidental costs that are periphery to your trial costs. Signing a consent form locks me into staying in a trial. Again, this isn't true. You're free to change your mind at any time. You are a volunteer on this study. And that's made very clear to you at the beginning. And when you sign that consent form, it's not, you're not locked in, period. You can always, it's always your choice. Or you may worry that you're going to be made to feel like a guinea pig. These are scientific experiments. Are you going to be prodded and poked and all this stuff? And actually, we've heard from many patients who participated in trials, not just immunotherapy trials, but clinical trials in general, that they feel empowered by the process. They really feel taken care of. I've heard of patients having their doctors on speed dial and texting at all hours of the night. I just had, diarrhea, doctor. It's 2 a.m. is, should I be worried about that? And there's a really good, clear communication between patient and the healthcare team, and that you feel that you're part of that. So, and that also comes from that dialogue. And dialogue is, it takes two to have dialogue, right? So do your part and ask the questions that you have. Don't be silent. The myth that clinical trials just aren't safe, of course, there's always risk, as I said earlier, but these are designed with multiple layers of review, both at the hospital level as well as at the federal or the regulatory, the government level that oversees how all of these trials are done, and are things being done ethically and up to standards. So you can feel pretty good that whatever your healthcare providers are telling you about the safety level of the trial that you're about to, or that you're considering, that you can take that as not gospel, but pretty well grounded in fact. So that informed consent form, or being an informed patient, means having all of the facts both during and after the trial. Again, these are just some of the things that you'll want to know. How will I be monitored? What are my alternatives? What can I expect? What are the risks, side effects, benefits, those sorts of things. Be bold. It's your treatment plan. And Mary Elizabeth also talked a lot about self-advocacy, or having that A team around you that's able to advocate for you on your behalf. Do that. It's all about you. If there's any one point in life where it's all about you, it's that moment, or those moments when you're in that chair talking to your healthcare team. So how can you find a clinical trial? You can ask your doctor. Some doctors, depending on where you're receiving treatment, may not be aware of what clinical trial options you might have. Or if you ask specifically about immunotherapy, because it's still relatively new, may not really understand how it works. So ask another doctor if you need to. Patient advocacy organizations are also fantastic, particularly if you have a specific type of cancer. If there's an organization or community that's focused on that, they often will have nurses or navigators that can assist you via phone or in person to find a clinical trial. We also have a clinical trial, an immunotherapy clinical trial finder on our service. It aggregates all the clinical trials that are in the known database and pulls out those that are immunotherapy. These are the trials that our clinical trial navigators will search if you're interested specifically in immunotherapy. We also have that phone number, 855-216-0127. Again, this will be shared with you, so if you want to write that down now, go ahead, but we will be sharing this with you later. If you have access to a computer, you may not have one at home. Maybe you can get to a library or even go to a treatment center near you where you can search online, either by yourself or with the help of someone. And again, that's our website, cancerresearch.org/patients/clinical-trials. Clinicaltrials.gov also is that national registry that I was talking about. You may find it, if you're new to the process, a little overwhelming or difficult to navigate. So that's why we highly recommend, if it's certainly your first time going through this process, go with one of those advocacy groups or give us a call. So with that now, I think we want to hear it. I can say everything about what receiving an immunotherapy in a clinical trial or a standard of care is like, but really we want to hear from the patients who have received these treatments. So I'd like to invite Dorothy, Oswald, and Tara up to the stage now to join me for a panel discussion, and I'd like all of you to please welcome them.